I didn't know it was happening at first. You can't blame me. I was only a kid when it started. I grew up in a small town in central Ontario with my father. My mother left when I was very young, leaving him to raise me on his own. I was his pride and joy, his only son. I remember him saying how lucky it was a lot. How lucky I am to have a kid like you. He would say with a twinkle in his eye, after I had aced a test or scored a goal at one of my soccer games. I always felt happy to be his kid. All the adults around me loved my father. He was an upstanding citizen, a model member of the community. He worked as a lawyer, an attorney. He made enough money for our tiny little family to live perfectly comfortably. I had a good childhood, needless to say. It was only around the age of 11 when things started to change. My dad was still a good father, still loving and caring, but something changed. I can mark the day that it happened in my mind, the day that it stopped, the day when he left, before it came back in his place. I had just lost my front tooth. I remember being so happy and excited to put it under my pillow, eagerly awaiting the morning knowing I would find a toonie under my pillow for my troubles. I was all curled up in my bed, fast asleep. I felt my father shake me awake. I squinted up at him, eyes hazy without my glasses. The room was still dark, and I could hear him breathing heavily. "Lucas, kiddo." His voice was rushed and hoarse. "Lucas, I don't have time to explain everything, okay? Everything is going to be, all right, okay?" "What's happening, Dad?" I whined out, just wanting to roll over and go back to sleep. He squeezed my scrawny arm tightly, keeping me facing him. "I did something wrong, kiddo. I made a mistake, and I have to go away for a little while, Lucas," he said, struggling to keep his tone even. "Where are you going?" I asked groggily. I'll only be out of town for a few days, I promise. I'll get Gracie to babysit. You like Gracie, remember?" He was trying to sound jovial, like it was a good thing. At the time, I didn't think anything of it. I did like Gracie. She bought me pizza and chips for dinner. I hate to say it, but at the time, that was enough for me to accept it. I nodded, and he smiled at me. "Good, I'm glad." "I love you, Lucas," he said, planting a kiss on my forehead. Those few days were good. I didn't even know what had happened. I ate pizza and I watched TV. I drew pictures for Gracie. I played hide and seek with my neighbors. And then my dad came back. He looked just like him, but he was cold all of a sudden, quiet, reserved when he wasn't before. He spent a lot of time away from me. He forgot to get the groceries some days. He forgot to come to my soccer games, or put my ACE test up on the fridge like he used to. He started spending more and more time in the backyard shed. Our once happy home was cold and gray. For the longest time, I was convinced that I had done something to make him hate me. It didn't stop at a neglectful father either. It was like the house itself had turned on me. It was an old house, and we had had issues with it before, but something changed about it. I remember one day going to take a shower. I stepped into the old tub and turned on the water, standing under the shower head and waiting for the water to come. For a long moment, I waited, and then I heard the pipes creak. Murky, rusty brown water hit me in a torrent. I stood there under it, unsure of what to do, red staining my hair, making me feel sick. I called for my dad out of confusion, leaping out of the tub and wrapping a towel under myself. When he showed up in the doorway, he looked me over, shivering from the cool air and drenched in disgusting water. And he laughed at me. He howled with laughter, cruel in its amusement and making my face burn with shame. I couldn't keep myself from crying. And even then, he just continued to laugh. Things only got worse from there. He didn't tuck me in at night anymore. He spent hours out in the shed, or in the attic, or fixing the pipes in the basement by the water heater. And the pipes acted up more and more. I would go to fill my water bottles and cups, only to find the pipes sputtering out rusty brown water. I would wake up to the sound of dripping, finding molding wet spots in the corners of the rooms, dribbling water from a leak somewhere in the ceiling. I asked him over and over again to go get a plumber, to go into the attic and fix it, that the problem wasn't with the water heater. But every time I mentioned the attic, he would get angry. He would stare me down and say, "I don't let anyone in the attic. They would make a mess of all my hard work." I wasn't allowed to go in the attic anymore, nor was I allowed in the shed or basement. The pipes weren't alone either. Next were the lights. Every time my father entered a room, the lights would sputter and flicker. I recall being in the kitchen one day. He came in to use the sink, and the ceiling light started to flicker before bursting. He hardly even registered it. He just looked at it blandly before leaving the room, leaving me to clean it up. I started acting up in school. I started yelling at teachers. I started handing in my work half finished. I started smoking cigarettes behind the portables, all in some desperate attempt to get my dad to even give me a second glance. None of it worked. Even when the teachers called home, all I would get was a, "Tell them to stop calling. I don't like interruptions." I think ultimately it was my anger that clouded my perception of what was happening. I remember one night, I was just 15 at the time. I remember looking out the window of my bedroom, blowing smoke out through the screen. I saw the backyard light turn on and watched the gate to the backyard open. My father was there. He had started spending time out at night. I assumed he was just drinking, but I was clearly wrong, because behind him he dragged an old wagon with a tarp over it. Whatever was under it was lumpy and misshapen, twisted up and gnarled. He dragged it into the shed and closed the door behind him with a loud bang. I could hear the whir of tools from the shed, but nothing more. The next morning when I was getting ready for school, the TV was turned on. I didn't pay attention until the program was interrupted with breaking news. A hitchhiker had gone missing. They were last seen in a bar from the town over. I got a sinking feeling in my gut, but I didn't know where to place it. There was no way I could connect the two incidents. I couldn't say for sure that what was under that tarp was what I thought it was. It happened again 2 months later. A hitchhiker, this time last seen in our town. And that same night, the wagon with the tarp over it. And again, 2 months after that, this time with a teenager from my school. I kept my mouth shut. I don't know why I did, but I kept quiet. Even as strangers and townspeople alike kept going missing, I couldn't admit that it was happening to myself. even as I stopped yelling in class, stopped handing assignments in late, even as I tried to be good for fear of ending up like all those people in my father's shed. I was 16 when I received the letter. My father never checked the mail. It was always my job. I'm thankful for that now. Among the magazines, junk mail, and newspapers, there was a letter in a simple white envelope. I unfolded the paper, walking back up to my room. Lucas, it's been years since I saw you. Every day I regret leaving, and every day I wish this had never happened. I don't have much time to explain everything, but you have to believe me when I tell you that the thing you've been living with in our house is not your father. It's not me. It's wearing my face and using my voice, but it isn't me. I know you won't believe me, but please, all I want is for you to be safe. I'm still out there. I had to run away. They said it would hurt you if I tried to intervene, but I'm still out there. I'm in a small town in northern Quebec. I can't specify further, but I'm in Quebec. I love you, son. Love, Dad. I stared down at the piece of paper, my hand shaking. I wanted to believe it. I wanted to believe those words on that page more than anything. But I couldn't. It was just a twisted prank someone pulled on me. It couldn't be true. But no matter how much I told myself that it couldn't be real, that doubt seated itself in my mind. It was such an abrupt change. I was just sure that he had gotten sick of me, but that doubt was enough. A month passed before it happened again. I crept out of bed and down the stairs, taking the front door and going around the side of the house to make sure that he wouldn't hear me. The grass was wet under my sneakers, and the cool autumn breeze sent a chill down my spine. I kept low, finally reaching the shed. I could hear better now. There was no power tool sounds, but instead, I could hear wet tearing, like the sound of someone butchering a chicken, the wet pop and slurp of peeling meat from bones. I felt sick, but I had to be sure. I inched my way up, peeking in through the grimy window. I froze. Standing at the work table was that thing that stole my father's face. It was just like my father in every respect, but my father's face was peeled away, thrown back over its shoulder like the hood of a sweater, a seam down the middle. It wasn't real skin. It was like a rubber costume, lifeless and empty. The thing underneath his face, it was like it was rotting, graying and emaciated muscles with no flesh to keep it protected from the elements, mottled and meaty, like dry aging steak. There were holes through the skin and bone, small, like sockets for something to fasten the meat on. Its arms were spindly and just so wrong, bones bulging and stretching the skin, and bending in unnatural places. On its table was a body, or what was once a body before he had tore it apart. It was peeling the meat off the bones. I half expected it to start eating, but it didn't. It just set the meat aside. I wanted to look away. I wanted to run, but I just couldn't. I couldn't bring myself to move, even as bile rose in my throat. It tossed the bones aside, and then reached up to its head and pulled a chunk of mottled gray meat off its skull. My stomach lurched, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. I just stared at it in abject horror as it plucked a strip of meat off the table and shoved it into the place where its old flesh once was. and then I picked up a screw and screwdriver and started bolting it back into place. I finally willed myself to move, queasily staggering across the yard and around the side of the house. I looked over my shoulder at it, but it was too busy. It couldn't hear me. I threw up at the side of the house into our trash can, my whole body shaking from head to toe. I felt faint, but I managed to make it inside and up to my room. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't sleep that night at all. In the morning, I left for school, unsure of what to do. I didn't have long before he would catch on that I was acting different. I couldn't run. I was sure that he would catch me. There was only one thing that I could do. It was after school. It was sitting in the living room in his armchair like it always did, eyes glued to the screen, completely still, hardly even breathing, just pretending to. It didn't ask how my school day was, didn't greet me or even say hello. Good. I walked past it and up the stairs. The metal bat was heavy in my hands, but it fit in them snugly. I walked into the living room, behind him quietly, socked feet nearly silent on the carpet. I raised the bat over my shoulder. You know, after my father disappeared, I'd always thought that he looked different. Looser around the edges, too much like plastic, but just enough to not raise any alarm bells. But I think it was the shape of his face that tipped me off the most. The bones weren't his under there, cheekbones too high, and eyes too sunken in. I think it must have borrowed a different skeleton. Whoever's skeleton it was had been getting more and more fragile over those 5 years of pretending, because as my back collided with the side of its head, the side of it sunk in with a loud, resounding crunch, like the sound of a piñata being hit. It reeled to the side before staggering out of its chair, whirling itself around to face me with its now drooping skin half sloshing off. I didn't waste any time, swinging again and hitting the other side of its head with similar results. It tumbled to the ground, reaching out and letting out an agonized scream in my father's voice. I didn't feel any remorse, stomping down into its arm with a crack and hitting it again, and again and again and again, until its head was nothing but mush behind its mask. I breathed heavily, staggering backwards, staring down at it. I was still for a long moment, and then it began to writhe, flopping about like a fish out of water, convulsing and squirming. The body rolled itself over, back arching up and down. I heard tearing, my father's shirt drenched in blood, before tearing open. My shield in my eyes, a bright light filled the room. Crawling out of the thing's chest was a being, a human-shaped person composed entirely of shifting, blinding light. It split open the creature's sternum, stands to its feet, and stares at me for a long moment. And then it faded away into nothingness, and I was alone in the living room. The steering wheel feels real under my hands. I left with the bag that I packed that morning and my father's wallet and keys, taking the car in my driveway and setting out for Quebec. It's been 5 days. Every time that I get any sleep, I have these dreams. Dreams of that thing made of light. But there are more of them, climbing into human bodies and looking for other humans that they can take, to sustain their form or give to others. In my dreams, they leave me messages and letters that I can't understand. I scream at them that I don't know what they're talking about, but they know I will understand in time. I try not to sleep unless I have to. It doesn't matter what they tell me. It doesn't matter that I can see them walking in the forest at night and floating in the sky like the bodies of the drowned. I don't care how long it takes. I just want to see my dad again.